Hello, my name is Steve Pickup. On this DVD I'm going to teach you how to build living willow structures. I will be taking you step by step through the process of choosing a site, preparing the ground, planting the willow and weaving the structure. First thing you need to do before building your willow structure is find a suitable site. Now this particular site here is not suitable. You have lots of overhanging branches casting deep shade. Plus you have tree roots underneath the ground competing for nutrients and moisture. Not a lot of space here in which to build a willow structure either. So I'm going to go to another part of the garden, see if I can find something more suitable. Now this is starting to look more like a suitable site. The ground is opening up, we have a lot more light, lots of sunlight coming in, nice wide flat open space, no competition from tree roots, perfect site. One more thing we need to check is that we have enough topsoil to plant the willow in. So I'm going to test it with a metal bar and a lump hammer. I'm simply going to drive the bar into the ground, make sure we have enough soil to plant the willow in. Seems to be going in okay. I just pull the bar out. Yes, plenty of topsoil there, just right. Next thing we need to do is prepare the site. The first stage of preparing the ground is to mow the grass or cut the vegetation. Now I'm going to mark out and lay the plastic, and I've decided this is going to be my corner point. The line of the fence is going to be coming up here and the arch will be extending this way, so this is my corner point. Now the next thing I'm going to do is take this mulch material and lay it along the line of the fence. Now I've already put a mark on this, 50 centimetres in from each side and 50 centimetres from the end, and that leaves a good 50 centimetres beyond the end of the fence and the arch to allow for better weed control. Now I'm going to take the hammer and a few pegs and roll out the plastic along the line of the fence. That's a little bit more. Then what I need to do now is line up this mulch mat so it's exactly in line with where I want it for the line of the fence. So I've got it exactly where I want it, in line with the fence. Now I need to peg down the mulch mat to the ground. I take a ground cover peg and a hammer. Now when pegging, you need to make sure that this peg goes about an inch in from each edge. You don't want to go in too far, otherwise that will flap loose. So about an inch in. And to begin, a nice sharp tap with a hammer to pierce the plastic, and then gently drive it through into the ground. Now I've laid the plastic for the fence. Next thing I need to do is lay the plastic for the arch. So I'll just open this out. This has already been cut to size, and I've also pre-marked this point here. Again, 50 centimetres in from the side, 50 centimetres in from the edge. So give a nice good area of weed control. So I'll just pierce that mark with my secateurs. Nice clean cut, not too big. And that will go over the wooden stick. And that allows an overlap between the two pieces of plastic of 20 centimetres or more, so you don't get weeds coming up through the gap in the plastic. Okay, so I have the mulch mat in position. Now I'm just going to smooth it out and peg it on the corners as before. Now that I've laid the mulching material, now is a good time to mention the first golden rule. Golden rule number 1 is to prevent weed competition. Willow, like any other plant, will suffer if it has to compete with other plants for nutrients, moisture and light. The purpose of the mulch material is to exclude the light from the plants and therefore kill them, so the willow can grow in completely weed-free conditions. Right. I'll take the measurement from this corner of the arch. That will give me the line of the arch, and I can judge that by eye to make sure this is at right angles. Now I'm going to measure 4 meters for this fedge. Now I already have 1.20 meters for the arch, so my marker point here is 5.20 meters, which will give me a 4 meter long fedge. So yeah, that's at right angles. I'm going to make a little hole, making sure it's not too big, just big enough to put in a stick. Just poke that through. Right, so I tap in my peg to mark the end of the 4 meter long fedge. Now I'm going to go and mark out the other 2 corners of the arch. Right, I'm going to go back to the original corner. I'm going to mark the last metre of this fedge is actually going to be an arch. So I'm going to mark a metre, just there, and again I'm going to make a little hole with my secateurs and put in a marker stick. I'll just tap that in gently with a hammer. Now I need to go to the other corner and mark the last corner. 1 metre along, parallel with the fedge. We have our 1 metre mark there. That will be 1.20 meters to the other corner. Just make a little cut with the secateurs and put in a marker stick. Gently tap that in with a hammer. Now I'm going to join these corners up with twine so I can see a lot better what I'm doing. First we'll join up one side of the arch. I'll take the string and mark the other side of the arch and the fedge. Now I'm going to pull this string nice and tight, wrap it around the stick, tie it off with a couple of half hitches. Now I have the line of one side of the fedge and the line of the other side of the arch. Now the next thing I need to do is finish off pegging the plastic. I just carry on putting in these pegs approximately every 25 centimetres all along the outside of the mulching material. For the next stage of marking out the positions for the uprights, I've cut myself a measuring stick 20 centimetres long, which is the space between each upright. I simply place it along the line, mark it with a piece of chalk, and then move along, mark the position for the next upright, and so on along the whole length of the fedge and the arch. I've marked out every 20 centimetres along the line of the fedge and one side of the arch. Now along the other side of the arch I'm going to use a bar. You can use a bar or you can use a willow rod or any straight stick. I'm going to run this across to mark just to make sure that these marks are exactly parallel with the ones opposite. I'll just move along and do the next one. Make sure that is straight and that is parallel, and then I'll mark the next one. Right, I have all the positions for the uprights marked out every 20 centimetres. Now I need to make a little hole in the plastic. Remember not to make this hole too big. If you make the hole too big, weeds will come out through there and compete with the willow. Now I've marked out the position for the uprights and made the slits with my secateurs. Now it's time to make the holes with the metal bars. and also a good time to mention golden rule number 2. Golden rule number 2 is depth of planting. When you plant a willow rod, you're effectively planting a cutting. Now normally with a cutting you put most of the cutting in the ground, but obviously with a 10-foot rod we can't do that. We can't dig a hole 8 foot deep. But what we can do is make sure that it's at least 12 inches deep. That will ensure that there are enough roots to support the leaves even in dry conditions. So now I'm going to make the hole with the bar. I'll just tap the bar a few times, then I'll wiggle it around, and I'll just drive the bar in an inch or two at a time. Give it a good wiggle around because the hole needs to be wide enough to insert the willow. You also need to be able to get the metal bar out of the hole as well. Right, now that feels about deep enough to me, so I'm going to check the depth with my thumb. I'll put my thumb on there, pull the bar out, and that looks about 12-13 inches. So that should be plenty deep enough. Don't worry if you don't have a long metal bar like this. Any tool that is hard enough to make a hole in the ground will do. A nail bar, which is easily available from a hardware shop, is often works well. I've made all the holes for the uprights for the fedge. Now I need to make the holes for the uprights for the arch. Now you can make vertical holes for the uprights for the arch, but a nice variation is to make the holes at an angle. Now the effect of this is if you make the holes at an angle approximately 45 degrees out from the arch, when you put them in you can bend them around and you make a nice curved shaped arch. If you put the uprights in straight, when you pull in to make the arch it makes quite a narrow arch, especially at the top. Not very good for broad-shouldered people. Now I'm going to make the hole for the upright of the arch, and I can make a shallow angle, I can make a steep angle. In this case I'm going to make an angle roughly 45-50 degrees. So I get the angle. I also need to line up my metal bar so it's exactly opposite the hole for the upright for the opposite end of the arch. So I've got that lined up, I've got the angle I want. Now I'm going to make the hole. Wiggle it around again. Again, making sure the hole is wide enough to put the willow in. Right, that feels about deep enough to me. I'm going to check it again. Yes, that's a good 12-13 inches, just as with the uprights for the fedge. Now I'm going to go to the opposite end of the arch and make the hole for that upright. We're ready to start putting some willow in the ground now. Now when you receive your kit through the post, you will receive willow already graded into different sizes. Now the purpose of this is we need different size willow for different parts of the structure. For the uprights we need good, long, thick and strong willow. For the weavers we need something shorter and thinner to weave around. Also for the uprights for the arch we need something even longer and thicker than for the fedge because it's going to be a larger structure. So now I'm going to take some uprights for the fedge and start to put them in. I'm now going to put the uprights in the holes. So I choose my first willow rod. What I'm going to do is cut off the bottom few inches. The reason I'm doing that is the bottom may have dried out slightly in transit. Also some willow are a little bit curly on the bottom. So I'll cut that curly bit off, or the dried bit off, about 2 or 3 inches. Nice clean cut. Hold that vertically and put into the hole. Now I just want to check the depth. So I put my thumb on the willow. Yes, that's about 12 inches, that's deep enough. So I'll pop that back in and I carry on with the rest of the willow. When you receive the willow through the post in the bundle, it's going to look fairly straight, but when you put it in the ground you'll notice there is some natural variation, which is why we have these willow leaning one way or the other way. Now what we're going to do now is twist these willow around so all the willow is aligned along the line of the fedge. So I'll start with the first one and I'll twist that around. Now it doesn't matter which way the willow is leaning, whether it's leaning towards that end of the fedge or this end, as long as what you need is approximately half one way, half the other way. When we come to do the binder, I will use the binder to help to pull these parallel. I'll just correct this one here, and then I look along the line of the fedge and check to see that all these willows are in fact in line. I think I'm fairly happy with that. So the next stage is to take a hammer and to firm the soil around the willow. So I'll start at this end. Also, when you're doing this, be careful to hold the willow vertically before you firm the soil. So that's nice and vertical. I'm going to start hammering a few inches away from the willow so that the soil at the bottom of the hole is compressed around the willow. Now I'll give it the tweak test. Yeah, that's nice and firm. I'll move on to the next one. Notice also when you're firming the willow in the ground, make sure that it remains aligned in the direction you want and hold it vertically. That will make life a lot easier later on. I'm now ready to put the uprights in for the arch. Before I do that, I need to select matching pairs for each hoop. So those two look fairly similar. Just stand them upright and check. And our matching pair is roughly equal length, equal thickness and a similar shape all the way along, and that looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to have that as my first pair and just put that to one side. I'll find my second pair, try those two. So again, I'll check them for length, thickness and shape, and they look pretty similar too. Here we have the end of the fedge where it runs into the arch on one side, and on the other side we have the other side of the arch. I've already selected my pairs of uprights, so I'm going to take the first one and start putting them in. First of all, I'll trim off the bottom few inches as I did with the uprights for the fedge. Now remember, we made these holes for the arch at an angle instead of vertical. So they're going in at an angle, but they need to be the same depth, minimum 12 inches. So I'll just check that with my thumb. Yep, that's a good 12 inches. That can go back in. And now I'll go to the opposite side of the hoop and put the other willow of the pair in the hole. Again, cut off the bottom few inches. If your secateurs aren't strong enough to cut these extra thick rods, then you can use a pair of loppers. And I'll just check that. Yep, that's a good 12 inches. Now I have my first pair and I'll put all the rest in. Now I'm taking the last upright of the last pair. Again, trim off the bottom few inches and put that in the hole. Just check the depth on that. Yes, that's a good 12 inches. And I just check the alignment of those as I did with the uprights for the fedge, and I'm happy with those. They're all roughly the same angle. So now I can firm in these uprights again as I did with the uprights on the fedge. Firm the soil around them so they're nice and solid. Right, I'm just finishing off firming the last of the uprights for the arch. Yep, that's nice and firm. Now I'll just check the whole arch. Everything's firmed in, everything's aligned. Now I'm ready to start making the hoops for the arch. Now I'm ready to make the first hoop of the arch, and I'm going to need a piece of string for a temporary tie. Now this piece of string has a loop in one end, and you see why when I join them together. So I'll just take a ladder. This is a good time to recruit an assistant, if there is one available, to hold the ladder steady for you. I take one upright and the other upright. Just going to step up the ladder a couple of runs. Now to begin with, I'm going to guess roughly the middle point and the height and tie it off. And don't worry if this is not perfect the first time, because it is possible to adjust these afterwards. So I'll just wrap that string around 2 or 3 times, then I'll finish off with a half hitch or a slip knot. Pull that tight. I can then release that quickly when I want to adjust. Take the ladder out of the way. Then I can stand back and have a look at the arch. Now to my mind there are several things not quite right with this arch. Firstly, if you notice, this side has a nice gentle even curve, whereas on this side this bottom section is fairly straight, and then we have a curve a bit at the top here. So I'm going to try and adjust that so they're more matching. So what I need to do is make this straight side more curvy. Now a simple way to do that is to stroke the fibres of the willow on the inside and bend them out at the same time. Right, so I'm just stroking the inside of this willow to warm up the fibres to make them more flexible, and I'm pushing out slightly at the same time, and that will give the effect of making this section more curvy. And this section here curving at the same time, and being careful not to kink the willow, as I explained before. Now I'll just stand back again. Now that's a little bit more curvy, but the whole thing has leaned slightly to one side. So I need to take both sides of the arch and just lean it across to try and even that up. Stand back again. And I think for our purposes at this point, that is good enough, and we can adjust later on if we want as well. So now I'm going to do the hoop at the opposite end of the arch and join the two together. I'm just finishing off adjusting the hoop on the other end of the arch, and I've adjusted it in a similar fashion to the way I did the first one to get it to match. Now I'm just going to stand back and check that they both match. Yeah, I think that's a good enough match for now. Now the next stage is to take a willow stick, a nice straight stick if you can find one, and join the two together. Let's place that up there, bring it down, and these will be tied in using separate temporary ties. I'm just going to step to the side and make sure that these are roughly the same height. And check that. Yeah, I'm happy with that. That looks about the same height. So now I'm going to tie in the stick with some temporary ties. And again, I'll take the ladder. Take another string and I'll tie in a temporary tie just as I did with the hoops. So I'll just wrap it round a couple of times, pull it nice and tight, and then I'll tie it off with a half hitch or slip knot. Now this willow stick is extending 3 foot plus out here. We don't need that much, so I'm going to just snip it off about 8 inches beyond the hoop for now, and then we'll trim it finally later. So I've tied one end, I'm going to tie the other end now. Now I have the two hoops, the two end hoops of my arch, roughly the same shape and the same height, joined together by a central ridge pole. The next stage is to join in the other hoops. Now that I have the central ridge pole joining the two end hoops, it's going to make doing these other hoops a lot easier. I can adjust them to exactly the same height. I've just finished attaching all the hoops to the central ridge pole. They're all in place. I just need to check again to make sure that everything's in the right shape. So looking at this arch from this side, it seems to me this one is sticking out slightly. So I'll just bend that down gently. So the problem with this one is it needs poking through on the ridge pole. So I'll just go through and pull this through slightly. Yeah, that seems to have done the trick. Let's check these. This one seems a little flat here, so I'll just give that a little stroke on the inside, get that a little bit more curved, and then I'll stand back. That looks better. I think I'm happy with that for now. Now I'll go and check the other side. Now we have the uprights for the fedge and the arch all in position in their holes and firmed in. We're ready to put the binder in. The purpose of the binder is to join everything together and hold everything in its final position, which in this case is vertical and parallel to each other. Now when choosing a pair of binders, you need a good straightish pair of willow, which are of equal thickness and equal length. Holding the pair of binders horizontally, you take the first upright and you feed the first binder in to the front of the upright. Take the second binder and feed it in behind the first upright whilst holding the upright vertical at the same time. Now I'm going to put in a temporary tie just to hold this in position. So when doing the temporary tie, again I've used a piece of string with a loop. Feed it through the loop and pull this nice and tight. The tighter it is, the firmer this will be held together and the easier the binding will be. So I just wrap that round several times. Now I'm going to finish off with a couple of half hitches. Again, pull that nice and tight. Now I have the binders tied in to the first upright. So I'm going to take the one nearest to myself, weave it over the top of the other binder, take it round the back of the upright whilst putting it in position which is vertical and parallel to the first one, and then remember to bring this back to the front so both the binders end up parallel and between yourself and the uprights. You take the binder nearest to yourself over the top of the other binder, round the back of the next upright, which you put into position vertical and parallel. Remember to bring the binder you've just woven back to the front, so again it's between yourself and the uprights. You have two parallel binders, and you carry on working in this fashion over the top of the binder, position the upright back to the front. Now that I've put in the first pair of binders, you can see the effect that these have. To this side here, where there's no binder, see the willow is leaning one way or the other. Where I've woven in the binder, all the willow, the uprights are vertical and parallel. Now the way this works is by the binder gripping the upright between two binders, and I can move the upright to one side or the other side, and the binder will actually grip and hold that in position exactly where I want it. Also, I've put in the binder at this height. This is a comfortable height for me to work at, just above my waist. Later I can move the binder up or down to its final position. Now when the pair of binders start to become a little bit thin towards the tip, you need to feed in your next pair of binders, otherwise these won't be strong enough to grip the uprights into position. Now when feeding in the binders, it's important that the new ones go exactly in the right position, and the way to achieve this is to put the butt of the new binder next to the tip of the old binder and then slide it along until you get to the upright. Now this binder needs to go in exactly the right position, in the same position as the old binder, which is in front of the upright and below the other binder and resting on top. That's going to go in front of the upright, slide along on top of the old one, below the other binder, and it needs to go a good 6-8 inch beyond the upright, and feed in the next binder. Again, put the butt of the new one on the tip of the old one and slide it along the top, and it goes behind the upright and above the previous binder, again a good 6-8 inches beyond the upright when it's vertical. Now I'm going to put in a temporary tie in here again, just to hold everything nice and firm, which will enable me to weave the binders a lot easier. Okay. So now I just wrap around a temporary tie, and I wrap it around several times, pulling it nice and tight each time, so the binders are held firmly, which will make the next stage a lot easier. Now just finish off as before with a couple of R-fitures, making sure that is nice and tight and held firmly. Now before carrying on weaving the new binders, just check everything is in the right position. All the uprights are vertical and parallel. I'm just going to move this one into the right position. I then take the new binders and work with the new binders only, forgetting about the old ones. So again, I have the two binders between myself and the uprights. I take the one nearest to myself, it goes over the top of the other one, behind the next upright, which is put into position vertical and parallel. The binder then comes back to the front, so they both end up between yourself and the uprights. Now coming to the last upright of the fedge, I'm going to weave the binder around that, exactly the same as before, and now I'm onto the arch. Now the uprights of the arch are curved, whereas the uprights of the fedge are vertical and straight, but the binding is exactly the same principle. Just carry on, you take the binder nearest to yourself over the top, behind the upright of the arch, and then back to the front until you arrive in this position, and then carry on as you did along the fedge. Now I'm coming up to the end of my fedge or arch, so I carry on weaving the binder, again positioning the uprights so they're nice and parallel. Now I'm on the last one, so I do the last weave, again bring that round, position the end hoop. Now I'm going to tie the end here with a temporary tie and cut these off. Pull the string nice and tight, wrapping it around several times. Finish off again with a couple of half hitches. Notice also that the binder here is still thick enough to grip the end hoop. Now we've got several feet sticking out here, so I'm going to trim those off, but I'm still going to leave a good 6 to 8 inches for now in case I need to do any final adjustments, and then I'll do my final trimming later. So I've put the binder on the fedge on one side of the arch. Now I need to finish off the binder on the other side of the arch. Now that we have the binder woven, I just want to stand back and check that everything is aligned perfectly. So I'm just going to stand back, check all my verticals. They're pretty good, they're vertical and they're parallel, but there's one here, or a couple here, to do with a little tweaking. Yeah, that's better. That one there. I'm also checking that the binder is parallel with the ground. And I'm checking that the arch uprights are parallel as well. Yes, I'm happy with that. Now I'm ready to go on to the next stage. The holes for the weavers go between each pair of uprights. Now when you're making the holes for the weavers, remember that 2 weavers go into each hole. Make a mark with my secateurs about 1 centimetre long, about the size of the bar. Now I'll take the bar, locate it in the hole and knock with the hammer. Again, just tap it in a few inches and wiggle the bar to get the hole nice and wide enough for the 2 weavers to go in. Okay, let's go a bit deeper with that one. And when I think it's deep enough, I'll just check with my thumb. Yeah, that's a good 12 inches. Before I make all the holes, I'm just going to check that this hole is in fact big enough for 2 of the willow weavers. So I take both of them together, put them in the hole. Yeah, they've both gone in 12 inches deep. So now I'm going to make all the holes to the same size. Now I'm making the holes for the weavers for the arch. So again, I just mark the middle spot between 2 uprights. But this time, because this is the arch and I made the holes at an angle, I need to make the holes for the weavers at the same angle. So that's roughly about there. So again, I just knock it in a few inches, wiggle the bar around, wiggle around, make sure it's big enough for 2 weavers. And it's important at this stage to get the same angle for the weaver holes as the upright holes. Okay, a little bit more, make it a little bit wider. That's probably deep enough, I'll just check. Yeah, that's more than 12 inches, so that's plenty deep enough. So I simply repeat that process for all the weavers for the arch. Now I'm ready to weave the weavers. First thing I need to do is determine the height I want the weavers to come to. I think this binder is a little bit low for my liking, it's going to get in the way. And that's no problem, so all I have to do is simply knock the binder up a few inches out of the way. When I've woven all the weavers, I can then readjust the binder to its final resting position. So now that I've done that, remember to cut off the bottom few inches as with the uprights, in case the bottom has dried out slightly. So I'm going to take the butt of the weaver, hold it up against the first upright. I'm going to weave in front and working down at an angle. I go behind the second one, again coming down at an angle. I go in front of the third one and to the next available vertical hole, remembering that the willow goes in vertically. Now I need to decide what angle I want this weaver to stay at. I can have this weaver straight, I can have it curved in. In this case I'm going to have it curved out slightly That's a nice gentle curve. Now I'm going to tie that in position with a temporary tie, just there. It's important to get this first weaver in exactly the position and angle that you want, because all the other weavers will be woven in exactly parallel to this one. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to move on to the second one. Again, I'm going to cut off the bottom few inches. I move to the next upright. I hold the butt in front. I weave downwards at an angle. I go behind the second upright, carrying on down at an angle in front of the third upright and into the next available hole, remembering again it's a vertical hole. Then I need to adjust the second weaver so that it's parallel with the first one and tie it into position as before. Now don't worry about these ties looking a little bit unsightly. They are temporary ties and they will all be removed at a later stage. So that's my second one. Take the third weaver, again clip off the bottom few inches and put the butt end in front of the next upright and weave down at an angle, going behind and in front of the third one and into the next available hole. Now notice here that the weavers are thinner than the uprights, and that is so the weavers will actually weave around the uprights and the uprights will not be affected. If we were to use thin uprights and thicker weavers, then the uprights would be bent out of position. So you always have the main framework with good strong sturdy willow and the weavers are always thinner. Now again, I'm just going to adjust that so it's parallel with the first two. I'm going to carry on in this fashion all the way to the end of the arch until I use the last hole next to the end upright at the end of the arch. Now we're going on to the arch bit now. Right, now I'm going to weave the weaver into the last hole along here. Again, I'll just snip off the bottom few inches in front of the upright, weaving down behind the next one, front of the next one, then into the last hole. This hole of course being angled because it's on an arch with angled uprights, and I'll just tie that in as before. Again, getting that nice curve parallel with the previous weaver. Now you're probably wondering what I'm going to do with the next weaver because there are no more holes left. I'm about to show you. You start off as before with the butt end in front of the upright. You weave down behind the second upright and in front third. In this case there is no hole to put it in, so what we do, we wrap it around the end of the upright and weave it into the hole. But before we do that, we need to stroke the inside of the willow to soften the fibres to avoid kinking, which is golden rule number 3. So I'll just get that into position. I'll estimate where that needs to be rubbed, that's about there. And I'll just give that a bit of a gentle rub to soften the fibres. That should do it. I'll just check my positioning once again. I very gently curve around, making sure I don't kink the willow in here, and then I push that into the hole. Let's take a tie, position that again so it's nice and parallel, and tie that in position. Now we have one more weaver to weave in here. Again, it's going to wrap around the end. Just choose a suitable willow. Again, I'll cut off the end, hold the butt end up against it, and in front I go behind the last upright, and here I need to wrap around, pull it down, and I go in front of the same upright and into the next available hole that only has one weaver in there. I push that down, and because this particular willow is more flexible, I don't need to rub the inside, and I will tie that in position just there. Now before we carry on weaving in the other direction, I'd just like to demonstrate golden rule number 3, no kinking. What I mean by kink is that happens when you try to bend the willow too quickly or too severely. Now that has been kinked, the sap in the willow can't flow beyond that kink, so it will die. So golden rule number 3, avoid kinking. I finished weaving the weavers in one direction, including the two end ones which wrap around the end upright. I'm now going to put the weavers in the opposite direction to the other end. So again, I cut off the bottom few inches of the bottom curly bit. I take the butt end, I hold it up to the upright. This time I'm weaving at an angle down to the left. I'm following the same pattern as before, in front, behind, in front, and in the next available hole. So I go in front of the first upright, going downwards. Point to remember here is the pattern applies to the uprights, not to the weavers. With the previous weavers, you just follow the line of least resistance. So the weaving pattern in front, behind, in front applies to the uprights only. So here I am, I'm going down in front of the third one into the next available hole, which will already have a previous weaver in. Now I'm going to tie that in with a temporary tie before carrying on with the other weavers. If you notice here on the first weaver going in the other direction, it's in front of the first upright, behind the second upright, so where the weavers cross they're on the same side of the upright, and again here they're in front of the third upright, both weavers going in both directions on the same side, and then into the hole. I take the second weaver. I'm now going to continue weaving to the opposite end. Again, I take the butt end, hold it in front of the first upright, work diagonally downwards, behind the second upright, in front of the third upright, and into the next available hole with only one weaver in there. Make sure it goes in deep enough. And again, untie this tie and tie them both in together. I've now woven in the second weavers to the other end, where the last two weavers need to wrap around the end upright as before. So first of all, snip off the end. I hold the butt end up in front of the first upright, behind the second upright, in front of the third. This now has to wrap around and go in the hole next to the end upright. That's managing to go around without me having to stroke the willow. This is a nice flexible willow. Again, I position it so it's nice and parallel and tie it in to the other weaver in front of the upright. That's it, one more weaver. So I hold the butt end in front of the first upright, behind the second, and I'll extend this quite a way through before I bring it around gently, avoiding any kinking, and in front of the next upright and into the next available hole. And I'll just gently wrap that around, position it and tie it in to the other weaver against the upright, and tie that in. Now all these weavers are woven in and in their respective holes. I'm just going to lean back, take a glance, that's okay. And the next stage is to start tying in the weavers on the bottom crosses with permanent ties. All the willow is now in the ground and I'm ready to start tying the willow in its permanent position. First of all, I'm going to tie these bottom crosses. I'm going to use this special tying tube. This is 3mm hollow tying tube and it has particular qualities. First of all, it's stretchy, which means that when the willow increases in girth, the tying tube will stretch to accommodate that. It's also UV stabilized, which means it will not break down in the sunlight for several years, and so the tie will stay on the willow until the willow is pressure grafted. I'm going to choose the first place to tie, which in my case is roughly in the middle of the fedge. Now I'm going to make sure that both weavers are in front of the upright and that the upright is nice and vertical. Now what I need to do is make sure that these weavers make a nice shape all the way up to the top cross before I tie. I cut a piece of tying tube approximately 18 inches. First of all, I pass it around the back and I give it a little stretch. This will make for a nice tight tie. I go around the front and around the back, another little stretch, and then back to the front where I tie it off with a reef knot. Now remember not to stretch it too tight, otherwise there will be no stretch left for when the willow increases in girth. So I finish it off with a reef knot. Again, another little stretch, just nice and tight, and I trim it off with a pair of secateurs. Now I'm going to carry on measuring and tying all these crosses, first to one end and then to the other end. I've now tied all the bottom ties where the two weavers cross the upright. There are three places where the weavers cross the upright. So there's the bottom cross where the weavers are in front, there's the middle cross where the weavers are behind the upright, and then there's a top cross where the weavers cross once again in front of the upright. I've tied the bottom tie. I'm not going to tie the middle tie, it's not necessary, but I am going to tie the top tie where I've already put these temporary ties. Just that. I've just stood back and had a good look at the whole structure, and checked all the shapes, that the uprights are vertical and all the weavers are parallel and making these nice gentle curves. Now I'm ready to tie the first top cross. Again, I'm going to pick a point roughly in the middle of the fedge, then work one way and then the other way. So I'm going to start on this one here. First thing I need to do is take off the temporary tie. Now the reason I use string for the temporary tie and not tying tube, as you can see, this is nice and easy to take off. If I was to use tying tube, once it's tied, it's very, very difficult to untie without cutting it off and then wasting the tying tube, which is a little bit more expensive than the string. So I'm now happy with that position. Now I'm going to take my piece of tying tube, which is about 18 inches long. Again, wrap it round the back, cross it at the front, pull slightly, remembering not to pull all the stretch out of it. Once again round the back, back to the front, and finish off with a reef knot. Just a little pull there, and trim once again. Now I've got my height on the top tie. Now I need to cut a measuring stick so I can tie all the top crosses in roughly the same height. I cut my measuring stick there, and then I move on to the next one. So position the cross, and again check that the upright is vertical and the weavers make a nice gentle curve parallel with the weavers next to them. I've now tied all the weavers where they cross the uprights at the top point, all at roughly the same height, except for the ends where there's only one weaver crossing the upright. It's the same process. I simply take off the temporary tie, make sure it's the same height, and then tie in with some tying tube. Again, pulling it slightly each time I go around, and finish off with a reef knot and trim that to make it neat as before. Now the weavers are woven in to their position. Now they need to be firmed in the ground just as we did with the uprights. Here we've got a little gap between the weavers, so I'm just going to pinch these together with my other hand and firm the soil around them just as I did with the upright. First on one side and then on the other side. Okay, there we have the first pair of weavers firmed in their hole. I'm going to go along the fedge and the arch, firming in each pair of weavers, each in their respective hole. After tying in the end weavers to the uprights, it's time to trim off the tips of the weavers. Now you need to trim at least 4 inches beyond the tie. I'm going to do that by eye. That's a good 4 inches. I'm going to cut there, discard the tip. I'm going to make a measuring stick, put it on the tie, get my measuring stick. That will enable me to cut all the weavers at the same length beyond the top of the tie. Now I'm just going to finish trimming the last 2 weavers. Oops. I finished the last one on the other side of the arch. Now I've trimmed all the weavers over the whole arch and the fedge. Now if you remember, we raised this binder up earlier on to make it easier to work on this section here. Now I'm going to press the binder back down. I'm going to press it down to just below the tops of the weavers. When the weavers grow and you have leaves and shoots coming out here, the binder will be obscured. I'll just gently press that down and stand back. I'm happy with that. Now I'll do the binder on the opposite side of the arch and the rest of the fedge. Okay, I'm just finishing off tapping the binder down. Now I'm going to stand back, look at the whole lot, make sure I'm happy with that. Yes, that's just right. I've adjusted the binder to just below the tops of the weavers, exactly where I want it. Now I need to replace these temporary ties with the tying tube, just as I did with the weavers, and trim the binder. Now this time I'm going to use a piece of tying tube about 2 foot long, a little bit longer than I used for these. And again, I'm just going to wrap it around. You needn't worry about stretching it too much at this point, because these binders are not going to grow. So I'll wrap that round several times, doing it nice and neat. Finish off, and then I trim the tie. I'm also going to trim the binder at this point. Just take my secateurs, cut a slanting cut at that point, and on the other side same again. And just discard those. Now I'm going to tie where one pair of binders is fed in to the previous pair of binders, and there are 2 points here where they need tying. Where the butts of the new binders are fed in, I'll just hold all the willow together, put the tying tube around there, again get it nice and tight. Wrap it round several times, tying it as neatly as you can with a reef knot. Pull it nice and tight.